Hi, Dimi.
Thank you. Dear friends, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to the 8th Zoom lecture of the 60th public lecture series of the Archaeological Research Unit of the University of Cyprus. Our wonderful director of the ARU, the Archaeological Research Unit, has asked me to present this evening's speaker. He will not be able to join us, but looks forward to our next meeting. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Kevin Fisher, Associate Professor of Eastern Mediterranean Archaeology in the Department of Ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern Studies at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada. Dr. Fisher holds a BA with first-class honors in classics from Brock University, an MA in Regional Planning and Resource Development from the University of Waterloo, and a PhD in Anthropology from the University of Toronto. His thesis on Late Bronze Age Cypriot monumental architecture won the Society for American Archaeology's Dissertation Award in 2008. He went on to hold a series of postdoctoral fellowships in the Department of Classics at Cornell University, at the Yukoski Institute for Archaeology and the Ancient World at Brown University, at the Center for Advanced Spatial Technologies at the University of Arkansas, and finally, with the Computational Research on the Ancient Near East project at the University of Toronto. He was hired as an assistant professor at the University of British Columbia in 2013. His research focuses mainly on the early complex societies of the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East, especially Cyprus, although he has worked on projects in Greece, Jordan, Peru, Guatemala, the United States, and Canada. His interests include the relationship between people and their built environments, urbanism and the social dynamics of ancient cities, and the application of digital technologies for recording, analyzing, and visualizing archaeological phenomena. He is co-director of the Kalavassos and Maroni Built Environments Project, which is investigating the social dynamics of urban landscapes on late Bronze Age Cyprus, and has been awarded a number of large research grants from Canadian and United States funding agencies in support of this work. He has published a number of journal articles and chapters on this work and is co-editor of Making Ancient Cities, Space and Place in Early Urban Societies, published by Cambridge University Press in 2014. His book, Monumentality, Placemaking and Social Interaction on Late Bronze Age Cyprus, was published earlier this year by Equinox Press as part of the Monographs in Mediterranean Archaeology series. Closing this introduction, we would like to kindly ask all participants to keep their cameras off and their microphones muted. Should you wish to address a question or comment to our speaker, feel free to use the chat button on Zoom. You may also switch on your cameras after the end of the presentation to address your question directly to the speaker by raising your hand and unmuting your microphone. Dear Kevin, we very much look forward to hearing all about late Cypriot monumentality. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Maria. Yes, I want to say Kalimera as it's still just after 9:30 in the morning out here on Canada's west coast. And with that, I wanted to begin by acknowledging that I both live and work on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded lands of the Hakaninim-speaking Musqueam people. I'd also like to thank Maria for the very kind introduction, and Thanasis and Maria for their invitation to speak in this amazing lecture series. I regret that Thanasis is unable to join us today. For a number of years, I was a program coordinator for the local Archaeological Institute of America Society here in Vancouver, and it was a challenge to organize 6 or 7 lectures over the course of an academic year. So I think it's a real testament to the ARU's organizational skills and, of course, its key role in Cypriot archaeology that this series is now in its 60th iteration, and that they somehow managed to run lectures on a weekly basis. So let me offer my congratulations. I hope you'll indulge me a bit. I want to pick up I'm going to begin by rather picking up one of the contemporary case studies interwoven into my recent book, taking you all the way back to 2017 CE rather than BCE, to a place called Cupertino, California. It's in April that year that Apple opened its much-hyped Apple Park corporate headquarters, estimated to cost some $5 billion. We might see this as part of a wave of impressive new tech giant headquarters in Silicon Valley around the same time, with Facebook, or Meta as it's now called, their new Frank Gehry designed facility opening in Menlo Park in 2015, and Google's Bayview expansion of its Googleplex campus in Mountain View beginning in 2013. All right, so letting me, hold on, so let me advance my slides here. Let me try that. Oh, there we go. Designed by A-list architect Norman Foster, the centerpiece of Apple's campus is a monumental ring-shaped ground scraper, who knew that was a word, dubbed the spaceship. It is a staggering 461 meters in diameter and 7 stories in height, only 4 of which are actually above ground, and it was designed to accommodate 12,000 employees. To put the size in perspective, the known area of late Bronze Age Ankeny would fit comfortably inside its circumference. The structure is notable for its extensive use of massive seamless glass panels, some of which on the building's exterior are 15 meters tall. Described as a statement of openness, of free movement, the design is intended to facilitate collaboration while materializing the company's penchant for design innovation and aesthetic sensibility, and its status as the world's most valuable brand. Indeed, it would be the last Apple design project that Steve Jobs had overseen before his death in 2011. Jobs wanted to, quote, to leave a signature campus that expresses the values of the company for generations. The attention to detail seen in Apple's products, some of you may have an iPhone sitting there beside you or are watching this on an iPhone. The attention to detail extended to careful, some might even say fanatical, control over the building's construction and materials. All interior wood used for furniture was harvested from a certain species of maple and subject to some 30 pages of guidelines. The door handle design alone took over a year and a half of negotiation. While the building is unquestionably impressive and widely acknowledged as a technological tour de force and a design icon, others have experienced it differently. Some have emphasized its contribution to suburban sprawl, seen it as out of step with the future of work, or critiqued its role in perpetuating the tech bro phenomenon with its 100,000 square foot wellness center, but complete lack of daycare facilities. The invisible glass walls and doors that were not allowed to have any kind of threshold, had negative effects on employees' experience of working in the building. It was not long before employees reported, under condition of anonymity, cases of coworkers being injured after walking into glass walls and using Post-its then to indicate the locations of glass doors, which the employees were promptly told by management to remove because they detracted from the design aesthetic of the building. I'm sure there's a joke somewhere in there about corporate transparency. Okay, but why this seeming digression to the Silicon Valley? Well, an interesting case study in its own right, I raised it here as a compelling illustration of the continued relevance of interrogating the relationships between people and their built environments and the power dynamics embedded in those relationships. In addition to emphasizing the role of materials and materiality in making something monumental, this episode also raises the issue of how the meanings of monumental structures are subject to competing interpretations and how those meanings might change and be reinterpreted over a building's use life. Today, I'd like to talk about some of these issues as they pertain to a much earlier manifestation of monumentality. I'm referring, of course, to the impressive structures erected at a number of sites during the Cypriot Late Bronze Age, what I've termed in my book an edifice complex. This period saw profound changes to both social organization and the built environment. This paper explores the relationship between these phenomena through the lens of the island's first large-scale monumental structures. More than just big buildings, these structures were contexts for social interactions, including ceremonial feasting and cultic rituals that materialize social inequalities, while also creating opportunities to forge social bonds and wider community identities. I will emphasize the importance of materiality and the use of symbolically charged materials in the creation of these monumental places and their ability to shape movement and encounter in new urban landscapes. I see this as an opportunity to highlight some of the themes of the new book and showcase some insights from work by the CAMBI project, particularly at Kalavasos Aias Demetrios. We're on fairly solid ground in trying to understand the social dynamics of spaces in buildings like Apple's headquarters. I'm sure I don't need to belabor the point that this is a far more challenging prospect when working with the often poorly preserved foundations of late Bronze Age buildings. To deal with this, I developed what I call an integrative approach. Its theoretical underpinnings lie in seeing space not as a container or a stage for social interaction and interaction, but rather as an integral part of those actions. Following the likes of Bordeaux, Giddens, Lefebvre, and others, it sees space as being socially produced and argues for a recursive relationship between the actions of human agents and the social production and change. As the Apple headquarters example amply showed, as the context in which most social interactions take place, built environments mediate and structure particular social interactions, and through their design and embellishment, affect the behavior of those who use or encounter them. They are at once products and producers of social life. Edward Hall, a seminal figure in environmental psychology, wrote that no matter what happens in the world of human beings, it happens in a spatial setting, and the design of that setting has a deep and persistent influence on the people in that setting. Or, as he was often able to do, Winston Churchill put it more succinctly, we shape our buildings, and afterwards our buildings shape us. I take an approach to monumentality that tries to move beyond seeing monuments simply as large, permanent, in scare quotes, public objects, and instead recognizes their relationality to particular communities, the meanings those people ascribe to certain things, and their role in local social dynamics and the production of identity and social memory. In this sense, monumentality can be seen as a process and a continuously negotiated relationship between the monument and those who experience it. Wu Hung likens the relationship of monument and monumentality to that of form and meaning in art history. The nature of this relationship and what a monument means are therefore highly variable socially, spatially, and temporally. Indeed, the very durability and persistence of many monuments all but ensures that their meanings will be challenged, appropriated, reinterpreted, or otherwise transformed over their use lives, a point I return to later, as this treatment of Sir John A. Macdonald's statue, as the founding figures of Canada, the way that they've been dealt with recently, and largely being removed or vandalized due to the role that Macdonald had in it as an architect of Canada's Indian residential school system. These aspects of monumentality compel us to move beyond a purely top-down or instrumental view of power that focuses on political authority and monumental architecture as a materialization of control over human and material resources by state and elite actors. This aspect is not absent from Cypriot monumental buildings discussed here, and as we'll see, there was undoubtedly, they were intended to provide opportunities just for that. Yet we might also see their construction and use as affording opportunities for the negotiation of social roles and statuses, and for building community through activities and performances that may have involved a wider cross-section of society during this period of profound social change. Such an agent-centered approach dovetails with a broader understanding of power in which it is both constraining and productive and constituted through various forms of social interaction. We should see power then not as inertly embedded in built environments, but rather as actively mediated through them. This approach acknowledges not just the agency of those who built, used, or otherwise interacted with monumental buildings, but also the agency of the buildings themselves. Lacking the intentionality of human agency, of course, buildings, like other things, exhibit what we might call material agency, which resides in the material properties and the affordances they present to human actors. As part of the built environment, I suggest that the late Bronze Age monuments that are the focus of this study have a wider scope to exert their agency than most other things, shaping patterns of movement interaction, and sensory perception. We must therefore examine the materiality of late Cypriot monumental buildings, focusing on the material properties and social meanings of the stone, plaster, earth, and wood of which they are made. These human material relations were enacted as people experienced buildings in daily practice, and particularly during the performance of social occasions, such as ceremonial feasting, during which people and things were brought into more focused interplay. The agency and materiality of the built environment are interwoven in the concept of place. Places are meaningful, socially constructed spaces that can exist at various scales, from a room within a building to an entire landscape. If space is the passive, neutral, physical location of social action, think perhaps of something like Cartesian or Euclidean space, then place is lived space, as Lefebvre put it, imbued with meanings, identities, and memories that actively shape and are shaped by the daily practice and experiences of its inhabitants, as well as historically contingent social processes. Places, according to Harmansah, quote, gather a vast range of things in their microcosm, both animate and inanimate entities, residues, materials, knowledges, and stories, end quote. The mutually constituting human-environment relationship embodied in places somewhat blurs the distinction between material and human actors. It is further obscured by the affective relationships that people often develop with the places in which they live. Well, these various high-level theories, as Michael Smith would call them, help us to consider how built environments and the actions that take place in and around them are connected to wider processes of social organization and transformation. What they don't do, however, is to provide a means of actually analyzing many of this stuff in the material remains of late Cypriot buildings. With that in mind, the other component of the integrative approach is a suite of analytical methods that could really be applied to any region or time period, and indeed, they have been used by others in a range of contexts. It begins by applying an approach called space syntax, initially developed by Bill Hillier and Julian Hanson at University College London in the 1980s. In particular, I use access analysis, a method well suited to helping us understand how the layout of a building configures space and thereby structures patterns of movement and interaction. It essentially breaks a building down into a series of spaces represented as circles with connections, usually doorways, represented as lines. Spaces that are the same depth from the origin point, which is usually taken as the exterior, but it doesn't have to be, can be lined up on the same level, creating what is known as a justified axis graph. The examples on this slide, I think, readily show how two similar-looking floor plans can generate significantly different patterns of access through the differing placement of doorways, creating very contrasting probabilities around things like privacy, publicity, movement, and encounter. This type of graph also allows for the quantification of some of these aspects, such as the degree of control that, sorry, I'm just going to pull this up, the degree of control that a space exercises over its immediate neighbors, or the control value, how well any one space is integrated into the overall configuration, what we might call integration or relative asymmetry, and depth of the space from the outside or any other starting point. But this tells only part of the story. Access analysis only takes into account what we call topology, the relationship of one space to another, arguing that that is the primary determinant of the likelihood for social interaction happening in any particular space. If there's anything, however, that environmental psychology has shown over the last few decades, it's that the size and shape of a space and the materials of which it is made have a significant impact on one's behavior, as does the presence of other actors and what they are saying, doing, and wearing. Here, my work has been influenced by Amos Rappaport's ideas about how built environments encode and communicate meanings regarding expected behavior through the use of fixed features such as walls, doorways, and benches, semi-fixed features such as furnishings, but also including non-fixed features, the physical and verbal expressions of the building's occupants and users, something obviously much more difficult to get at archaeologically. Redundancy of these meanings or behavioral cues is important if they are to be understood. Yeah, this doesn't really account for how someone might have experienced these built environments, physically or sensorially. With that in mind, I also analyzed visibility using isovis and viewsheds as a way of capturing something of the visual experience of the space. Of course, this is a two-dimensional proxy for a three-dimensional phenomenon, and such analyses have been criticized for the perpetuation of the tyranny of the eye, as one scholar put it, or ocular centrism, as others have called it, particularly when sensory archaeology emphasizes multi-sensory engagement that people have with their environments. Yet, we know that visibility is typically the single most important sense for navigating built environments for most people. And with the foundations that remain of most late Cypriot buildings, we're on the surest footing in assessing their impact on human visibility, as opposed to any other senses. And thinking about the ways we may understand people's interactions in built environments, not just through vision, but other senses as well, I've turned to environmental psychology. Edward Hall's important work on proxemics is especially useful in illuminating the relationship between interpersonal spacing and human sensory perception during social interaction, and suggests a range of distances at which certain types of social interaction might take place. One of the key things these analyses allowed me to do is to develop a set of parameters that would isolate spaces more likely to host particular types of social interactions. Here I was influenced by sociologist Erving Goffman's work on social interaction, which distinguished between passing encounters and a hallway kinds of interactions, which he called gatherings, and more focused social occasions, which can involve both routine events, such as the daily preparation and consumption of food, or more irregular events like a wedding, that are more formally delineated in time, space, and in terms of their participants. Focusing on the latter, I developed a typology with two general types of occasions: public inclusive and private exclusive, each characterized by spaces of different sizes and syntactic properties. I use the terms public and private here in a relative sense. Public occasions, for example, would have larger and perhaps in some way more inclusive groups of participants, including selected visitors from outside the building, rather than just being open to anyone. And admittedly, I've never really been entirely satisfied with these terms, that they adequately capture the nuances of each of these types. And these two types of occasions do not necessarily have to be separate temporally and could in fact be facets of a single occasion. They are perhaps best considered as points along a continuum, tending towards publicity and inclusiveness at one end and privacy and exclusiveness at the other, rather than discrete categories of interaction. I applied this approach to the study of a number of late Cypriot monumental buildings. These are chosen for a variety of reasons, but having complete published ground plans was a key consideration. Tychios's 1948 to 1958 excavations of the two complexes at Enkemi, the Ashlar building and the fortress complex, provided two of the case studies. His outstanding work, with its thorough description, illustration, and discussion of the recovered monumental architecture and associated finds, provided a wealth of information through which to analyze the relationship between the built environment and social dynamics, making these buildings ideal candidates for detailed case study. Both have the benefit of long, well-documented sequences, which allowed for the diachronic examination of these dynamics through a biographical approach. The so-called fortress, perhaps the island's earliest large-scale monumental building, and its successor structures, with a chronological span covering nearly the entire late Cypriot period, provide an important glimpse into interrelated architectural and socio-political developments in the early phases of this period. For the latter phases of the late Cypriot, the successors to the fortress overlap chronologically with the Ashlar building, providing a useful comparison. The Ashlar building offers important insights into the transformation of a monumental complex, including the deliberate erasure and alteration of symbolically charged materials and spaces. In its second iteration, this building housed the well-known Sanctuary of the Horn God, which provided an opportunity to investigate relationships between architecture, power, and the performance of cultic practice. I also examined three monumental buildings: Building 10 at Kalabassos Sais Demetrios, the Ashlar building at Moroni Vornes, and Building 2 at Elasa Paleotaverna. which have their origins in the late Cypriot 2C and share some broad similarities in being largely ashlar-built, court-centered structures that appear to be the focus of authority in their respective regions. Yet, their spatial configurations and the way in which the material components of monumentality are deployed differ significantly, attesting to the fact that there was no strict template for how such a building should be laid out. Despite past attempts to apply various functional labels to the buildings in this study, usually economic, administrative, or religious, perhaps one of the most important conclusions to the present analysis is that they have in common the dedication of significant amounts of space to hosting social interactions. Indeed, I would argue that whatever other economic or administrative functions might have taken place inside their walls, one of their main purposes was the provision of context for various types of social occasions through which their elite inhabitants could interact with various other individuals and groups that made up late Cypriot society while controlling the setting and tenor of those interactions. The level 2B fortress complex is perhaps the exception in that the only exception in that it contained only a single space that had the syntactic and architectural characteristics suited for public inclusive interaction. On the other hand, the reception of guests may have been incompatible with a heavy emphasis on copper production in that level of the complex. While public inclusive contexts are designed to be relatively accessible to visitors, private spaces with their greater depth, lower visibility, and narrower doorways are meant to be physically and visually less accessible to visitors and would likely require the permission or guidance of building occupants in order to find them and enter them. Many of the social occasions that took place in the buildings analyzed in the study likely made use of both types of contexts. While social occasions can be spatially and temporally discrete, taking place in a single space over a short duration, they are often larger in scale, requiring more spaces over longer periods of time. Such occasions typically center on the larger scale public inclusive space, which we might call a node, but also require adjoining spaces for associated activities, for more private parts of the occasion, and for the storage of equipment used during these activities. In many cases, buildings had multiple venues that could be used for different occasions, or even simultaneously as a way to filter participants according to social status. The Ashlar building at Enkhumy, for example, had 3 large rectangular hearth rooms. Yet one, room 14, pretty much in the middle of the building, was clearly the most important venue, both socially and symbolically. The syntactic analysis bears out its central role in the building's spatial configuration and also the presence of adjoining ancillary spaces. It was made mainly of the most elaborate forms of ashlar masonry, orthostats on top of a plinth with drafted margins, and had a carefully constructed hearth which served as a focal point for view sheds from either of the 2 main entrances. In what was perhaps some kind of foundation ritual, the floor and soil beneath the hearth were removed nearly down to bedrock and refilled with soil mixed with potsherds and some pieces of the original floor, and then capped with red mud mortar before the new 1.2 meter square hearth was installed. The room could not be entered directly, but only through vestibules. The most elaborate one was from the street and was most likely to have had a now robbed ashlar threshold and jambs, and there's evidence for antithetically placed wooden pilasters at the room's midpoint, along with a platform that looks like a hearth, but with no evidence for burning, perhaps a symbolic hearth of some sort. This room was undoubtedly the building's official entrance, meant for the highest order social occasions, while the other 2 hearth rooms, rooms 45 and 46, were built mostly of rubble masonry and lacked the architectural elaboration of room 14. But what were these social occasions? Whatever other functions they perform, analysis of various late Cypriot monumental buildings suggests that they were, for the most part, intended to provide spaces suitable for social occasions that involve feasting and similar powerful sensorial performances, including cultic practice. Feasts are social occasions that involve the communal consumption of special food and drink or unusual quantities of normal foods, often involving social display. Michael Dietler sees feasts as a form of public ritual activity and emphasizes the importance of performance which frames feasting occasions in, quote, symbolically pregnant action marked off from other kinds of daily practice, thus focusing people's attention and rendering them receptive to episodes of heightened emotional experience, end quote. These various social occasions were performances of ritual, which can be seen as a culturally constructed system of symbolic communication consisting of patterned and ordered sequences of words and actions, often expressed in multiple media, whose content and arrangement are characterized by varying degrees of formality, stereotypy, and redundancy. I would argue that the hosting of such events in monumental venues was not only a key strategy underpinning late Cypriot elite power at all levels, but also an important element of late Cypriot social dynamics more generally during the urban phase of the late Bronze Age. While some of these occasions were intended to build or symbolize group solidarity or mask inequity, others were meant to reify inequity, emphasizing exclusivity and the social distance between hosts and selected guests. Often both aspects were part of the social dynamic of a given occasion. Feasts play an important role in creating and maintaining social relations that bind individuals and groups together in social networks, ranging in scale from local household clusters to the regional political community. They are also venues for micro-political interaction, or what Dietler calls commensal politics, aimed at the acquisition of social and economic power, or the symbolic reiteration, naturalization, and legitimization of existing or institutionalized asymmetrical power relations. Many such occasions were likely diacritical feasts based on the use of differentiated cuisine and styles of consumption as a diacritical symbolic device to naturalize and reify concepts of rank difference in the statuses and of social orders or classes. The success of such a feast relies on the use of distinctive foods, often requiring complicated preparation, as well as elaborate dining sets, prescribed standards of etiquette, and reference to exotic social practices as symbols of exclusivity and social distances. While others have noted the socio-political role of feasting in the late Bronze Age, the specific venues in which it took place have received scant attention. In the case study chapters of my book, I demonstrate that the architectural and syntactic properties of spaces, in conjunction with ceramic and faunal evidence, can isolate probable contexts for feasting. While some of these materials are found within the feasting rooms themselves, for example, the numerous Mycenaean vessels found in around the Hearth Room 14 in the level 3A Ashlar building at Ankeny. These materials are sometimes recovered in adjoining spaces where they may have been stored when not in use. I'm thinking here, for instance, of the vast bowl stacks in room 10 of the Sanctuary of the Horn God, or even things that were discarded. For example, the room 173 feasting deposit from building 10 at Kallivasos Aias Demetrios. The importance of the places in which feasts were held is due as much to their delineation and reification of social boundaries as it is to their role as suitably impressive context for interaction. Most of the buildings in this study were designed so as to accommodate public inclusive and private exclusive interactions, both as part of the same occasion or as spatially and temporally discrete events. Therefore, in places such as the central courts of Alasab Paleo Building 2, or Building 10 at Kallivasos Aias Demetrios, public inclusive feasts could include large numbers of participants, providing opportunities on one level for the hosting elites to create or emphasize social bonds with a wide range of guests in order to secure their support or forge a wider community identity. But how did one create a place suitable for such events? How did one build monumentally? The creation of the monumental places analyzed in the study involved the dynamic interplay of material and human agencies. People's experience of these buildings began with the initial planning and construction, a process of materialization that transformed ideas and values into a physical reality. Desmarais et al. Emphasized that this was an ongoing process of creation and quote, that to materialize culture is to participate in the active, ongoing process of creating and negotiating meaning, end quote. Monumental building programs were complex and long-term undertakings that involved a number of stakeholders, from the elites who commissioned the building, through architects, various trained craftspeople, and numerous skilled and general laborers, all of whom engaged with wider human material networks and would have contributed to the building's biography and encoded meanings. Since agriculture and animal husbandry were predominant subsistence strategies for most people in late Bronze Age Cyprus, such intensive and prolonged building efforts may have had a profound impact on local economies. Ultimately, the material entanglements inherent in these projects would have directly or indirectly touched the lives of many people across the socioeconomic spectrum. In this way, the construction of a monumental building may have played a role in the forging of wider community, urban, or perhaps even island-wide identities, potentially serving as a component of more corporate-leaning strategies of governance. In trying to imbue places with meanings that conveyed their power and identity, while at the same time facilitating desired behaviors in those who use these places, and providing opportunities for themselves to engage in or avoid social interaction, elites faced a number of choices regarding spatial configuration and materials. I'll just put this back up to as I go on here. Recall from Rappaport's nonverbal communication approach mentioned earlier that choices were further constrained by what he refers to as the culturally specific palative elements. These are things like height, size, color, orientation, materials, and the display rules by which these elements could be combined to encode meanings. For late Cypriot elites, there was also the potential to draw upon the longer established traditions of monumental construction of neighboring cultures with which they had regular diplomatic and economic contacts. Back to that point a bit later. Design choices were constrained to some degree by the affordances of the building site, including whether or not there was extant architecture that needed to be referenced or incorporated into the design or removed altogether. My case studies indicate complex relationships between new buildings and the extant built environment, ranging from effacement to incorporation and reuse. In some cases, such as at Alassa Taverna, the site required extensive modification, including leveling and terracing, itself a form of monumental construction that marked the initial appropriation and transformation of space. The materials of which the building was made, part of Rappaport's palette of elements, were of primary importance in encoding and communicating meaning. I turn now to discuss these materials and consider the materiality and meaning. I'll focus primarily on stone, and particularly on ashlar masonry, as the most visible and enduring expression of elite identity on late Bronze Age Cyprus, before moving on to consider more briefly other materials such as rubble masonry, earth, plaster. Ashlar, or cut-stone masonry, was used for a variety of features in late Cypriot monumental buildings, including columns, capitals, thresholds, steps, well and toilet heads, occasional floors, and even large vessels and basins. But it was in its deployment in walls and thresholds that ashlar was most visible and likely to be encountered in daily practice. It is the material component most closely associated with Cypriot monumental construction, although one that, as we shall see, was perhaps not absolutely definitive. What is it about ashlar masonry that made it such an effective means of materializing eliteness? Following Bruce Trigger's 1990 thermodynamic model, we might see ashlar masonry at its most basic as a highly durable and visible form of conspicuous consumption of energy, one that symbolized elite control over material and human resources. But how much energy? Building on Gunnar Holt's work, I've made some attempt to categorize the various types of ashlar masonry according to their elaboration, but this doesn't really tell us how much work and time were needed to produce a particular type. Rather, we could really use an energetics study of late Cypriot monumental construction, following on the efforts of Jan Breisbart and Rod Fitzsimons, who have applied this to Mycenaean examples, or Maud de Volder's work on Minoan architecture. Two of my grad students, one current, Caroline Barnes, and one former, Graham Braun, now in the PhD program at University of Cincinnati, are actually taking on this challenge. Such studies aim to calculate the labor inputs of various stages of the construction process, covering the entire chaîne opératoire, or sequence of operations from quarrying or production to installation and use. We know very little about the people involved in this process or how their work was organized, but a detailed energetic study would shed light on these human dimensions of ashlar production and other building materials. It was a process that undoubtedly involved the long-term engagement of individuals with architectural and engineering expertise, a number of skilled and general laborers, overseers, and support workers at various quarrying sites and the construction site itself, creating a web of human material entanglements beyond the spatial and temporal extent of any single project. Ashlar construction demonstrates an intimate knowledge of the technical properties and aesthetic qualities of stone, beginning with a selection of source material. I should acknowledge here the importance of both G.R.H. Wright's exhaustive study of ancient Cypriot building, as well as the work of the University of Cyprus's own Maria Philokopoulou on the technical aspects of late Bronze Age ashlar and mud brick sourcing and production. The affordances, to use Gibson's term, offered by particular stone sources clearly contributed to their desirability as quarries. The Kalavasos Aias and Moroni Vornes ashlar masonry was made from the calcareous sandstone from the Pakna geological formation. A former undated quarry site in Tokeny, about 4 kilometers northwest of KAD, Kalavasos Aias clearly shows the natural layering and discontinuities in the Pakna formation, affordances that lent themselves to the easy removal of rectangular pieces of stone, including some that were exceptionally long, such as the columns of the Pythos Hall at Aias Demetrios. The natural planes in the source material undoubtedly influenced and constrained the size of many ashlar blocks, although this needs further quantitative study. The blocks were roughed out with lifting bosses at the quarry using the channel extraction method. They were then transported to the building site, perhaps by ox cart or by boat where feasible, where they were finished, as indicated by the finds of ashlar debitage at Aias Demetrios, Moroni, and Ankumi. This brings me to some of the exciting work that Caroline Barnes and Graham Braun will be presenting at ASOR this week as part of their energetics study. Using and comparing a variety of high-resolution digital recording methods, including terrestrial laser scanning and photogrammetry, they've been recording samples of ashlar masonry from Building 10 at KAD. We see here, for example, digital meshes from one of the orthostate blocks from the Pythos Hall, as analyzed using the GigaMesh software package. The angle-to-plane analysis vividly highlights the series of tool actions employed to dress this block. This, I think, could be usefully combined with a metrological analysis of known Cypriot masonry tools. I'm thinking of Nick Blackwell's work here to identify the use of particular instruments. So stay tuned for further developments on that. As Cypriot ashlar walls were usually made with shell construction, the blocks were only finished along visible or directly adjoining surfaces. In the most elaborate form of masonry, this meant cutting back along a narrow margin through which adjoining blocks could be aligned, leaving a raised central panel. Once the blocks were in place, the central panels could have easily been removed to create a uniform surface, yet they were typically retained, becoming an important stylistic element of Cypriot ashlar masonry. As we just saw at KAD, for example, the central panel and lifting bosses were left roughly finished with obvious tool marks. This acted as a mnemonic device, symbolizing the process of monumental construction and hence elite control over that process. It materialized the possibly distant place from which the blocks came, the labor that was required to quarry them and move them to the site, and the technical and managerial expertise needed to make a building with them. You might see this as the equivalent of the cutaway images used to advertise exotic cars that reveal the complex engineering underneath the sleek exteriors. My car does not look like that one. Here too, we see the affordances of the stone itself that may have played a role in the final appearance, with the softer sandstone lending itself more easily to the creation of deep tool marks, which, with the retained lifting bosses, enhance the visual saliency of the masonry through the interplay of light and shadow during changing lighting conditions. I recall Sophocles mentions this as the ashlar at Building 2 at Alissa as well. The orthostats from Temple 1 at Kidian, by contrast, were made from the harder, whitish-colored reef limestone from the Caronia Formation, lending themselves to a smooth, fully dressed, highly reflective surface. Deployed in the facades of monumental buildings in urban settings, ashlar masonry was therefore an essential component of elite placemaking and a highly visible and effective means of materializing elite identity and urbanity. In a world where mud brick in various stages of decay was likely an ever-present part of daily life, the apparent permanence of cut stone masonry, and indeed the underlying social order through which it was constructed, undoubtedly sent a powerful message. This was enhanced by the foreign associations of ashlar masonry, which signaled the engagement of Cypriot elites in a globalized culture that connected them with their distant counterparts throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, further legitimizing elite position and authority. Hitchcock goes so far as to suggest that Cypriot elites were instrumental in the creation of an international style of architecture in the late Bronze Age. While Wright states that during its brief floret on the island, Cyprus, quote, Cyprus became perhaps the leading province in this manner of construction. The materiality of ashlar masonry made it a most effective means of encoding and communicating multivalent meanings relating to elite identity, power, and monumentality. It was often used strategically in monumental buildings, placed where people would see it. As Canadian philosopher Marshall McLuhan famously put it, the medium is the message. As important as ashlar masonry was in materializing elite identities, it was not the only means of building monumentally. The material agency of cutstone masonry did not operate in isolation, but as a component of an assemblage or network of things, as material properties and qualities contributed to the making of places. Indeed, we might take a similar approach in briefly considering the interconnected materialities of a few other important elements of monumental built environments. With the exception of Alisah's Building 2, most late Cypriot monumental buildings retained a significant amount of rubble or fieldstone masonry in their construction. Naturally occurring or roughly shaped fieldstones bound with clay mortar were used as the foundations for the walls of nearly all late Bronze Age Cypriot buildings, and were used to construct features such as platforms, pits, steps, and benches. In monumental buildings, rubble masonry was used not only as a foundation for mud brick walls, but also as a foundation or leveling course for ashlar walls and as a component for the fill in ashlar shell walls. This, quote, mundane stone, as Cooney calls it, is given scant attention in studies of late Bronze Age construction. Yet its deployment in various forms in late Cypriot built environments suggests that it was often a process of careful selection and preparation of source material that could convey meaning regarding the relative importance of a structure. At KAD, for instance, Alison South distinguishes a more elaborate form of rubble masonry, which she calls official style. It consists of carefully laid courses of tabular limestone, as you see here in this slide, with wide, flat edges that in some cases were partially dressed. Walls made in this manner are around 90 centimeters wide, whereas the rubble walls of typical domestic structures of the site are 60 to 70 centimeters wide. This type of masonry was a significant component of Building 10, otherwise known for its impressive ashlar. The Calabasas and Moroni Built Environments Project is currently excavating Building 16, just to the west, a newly discovered 28 by 13 meter court-centered structure, which I've described as monumental given its form and size. Yet the excavations so far indicate that its foundations were constructed entirely of official style rubble masonry. It appears to be a venue for significant ritual activity, despite the lack of ashlar. This is a view of room 2 from that building at the end of our field season that we just completed this past summer. And I just want to point out some of the evidence of ritual activity there. The room turns out probably open air. You can see there's a large stone platform. There's a bench coming out, running along the north-south wall, curving slightly as it heads eastward. There's a large gypsum, I don't want to call it a monolith, but carved block sitting on a stone platform on the earthen floor. The room also contained a whole bunch of deer skull pieces with antlers, a gypsum stand, a Triton shell that was pierced with the end cut off, so probably used as a musical instrument, a whole bunch of wall bracket pieces, and slag. And there's evidence that the stones on that platform were burnt. So I think so certainly some significant uh, evidence for high level ritual activity. Yet really no ashlar to be seen in this room except for the stairs that you see sort of in the southeast corner. The Cyclopean boulders incorporated into late Cypriot fortification walls at sites like Enkumi, Kidian, and Mont Polycastro were the largest rubble architectural components and likewise contributed to the monumentality of these structures, signaling their strength and permanence as both physical and social boundaries. The newly discovered, or fairly newly discovered, 1.5 to 2 meter wide wall 10 at Moroni Vorne shows how even smaller, largely unworked stones could be made into monumental structures. Even if we don't know what that monumental structure is doing. Despite my emphasis on masonry, late Cypriot monumental buildings were, by volume, built mostly of earth. Sun-dried plastic earth was used as both a mortar and plaster in wall construction and, of course, to create mud brick, also called adobe. Given its ubiquity, mud brick would be easy to dismiss as having little significance beyond the practical function it typically served. Strong and easily made, it was a building medium well suited to the Mediterranean climate, with excellent insulating properties that allowed structures to be relatively cool in the summer and warm in the winter. While these properties are fairly well known, the social dimensions of mud brick manufacture have rarely been considered. In one of the few archaeological studies of the materiality of mud brick, Serena Love sees mud brick construction in Neolithic Anatolia as public performance and suggested that during the manufacture and transportation of mud bricks, quote, the time and labor expense is derived from an entangled, multi-phase production cycle requiring several locations, people, tools, materials, forethought, preparation, and time, end quote. She further argues that mud brick manufacture and construction was, quote, actively performed in the public sphere, end quote, such that the production and consumption of bricks became a key venue for the communication of social statements. I think this applies equally to late Bronze Age Cyprus. Certainly a vast quantity of mud brick was required for building the late Cypriot monumental structures discussed in this study. The principal components of earth and water with some type of temper place constraints on the spatial and material dimensions of mud brick manufacture. It would have been more expedient to make bricks close to a water source and then transport the dried bricks to the site. Indeed, in historically attested vernacular Cypriot mud brick production, materials were typically obtained in the immediate area, usually next to riverbeds, a process borne out in recent chemical and mineralogical analyses of Neolithic and Bronze Age mud bricks from several Cypriot sites. The drying of the mud bricks typically took around a week and meant that production usually took place in the warm, dry summer months. Thus, mud brick manufacture may have placed significant temporal constraints on the late Cypriot monumental construction. A preliminary analysis of mud brick samples from the northeast area of Kalabassos Ayas by geoarchaeologist Rachel Kulik indicates general consistency in the proportions of sand, silt, and clay from samples taken from several different contexts. This work is ongoing, but the results so far suggest the existence of some kind of common recipe, raising the possibility of an organized craft production and perhaps even centralized oversight of mud brick production. At Elysa Paleo-Taverna, the mud brick walls and the fill of the cores of shell wall ashlar plinths were made with red mud from iron oxide-rich terra rossa soils. That are not found near the site, but nearly 6 kilometers away to the southwest. Whether it was the color itself or some other physical characteristic of the soil that was desired, this demonstrates that even earth with particular properties could be transported in large quantities for some distance in late Cypriot monumental construction. While the mud brick in monumental buildings was ultimately rendered largely invisible by plaster, the process of mud brick production and construction was likely one of the most visible components of monumental building. As the material that typically covered the mud brick, plaster was another key component of late Cypriot monumental construction and was deployed in a variety of contexts, particularly walls, floors, and road surfaces. Its application over earth and stone transformed spaces, giving them different visual, tactile, and acoustic properties and allowing for a different range of uses. The production of lime and gypsum plasters requires substantially higher labor and resource inputs, and as a pyrotechnology, a more complex set of technical skills and knowledge than earth building materials. Studies by Philip Kiprou and Wallace suggest that pyrogenic lime plaster, which was more durable and difficult to produce than gypsum plaster, was typically used in late Cypriot monumental construction. It is made from quicklime, which is produced from the thermal disintegration of limestone or other carbonate rocks, such as dolomite or chalk, at temperatures of over 800 Celsius. Understanding the technical and social dimensions of plaster production and use has been an objective of the ongoing geoarchaeological work of the Cambie project at Calabasas Agios Dimitrios. These investigations are aimed at obtaining high-resolution data on urban placemaking and include the analysis of plaster surfaces from various contexts in both the current Cambie excavations and the earlier work by Alison South, using things like Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy and micromorphology. Hannah Herrick, a PhD candidate from Simon Fraser University here in Vancouver, is trying to analyze and replicate the process of late Bronze Age lime production using materials local to the area around KAD. Philo Kiprou argues that the very thick lime plaster floors that they were specifically connected with buildings belonging to the ruling class of a particular community. The final floor of the Pythos Hall in Building 10 at Agios Dimitrios, for example, is capped with a 10-centimeter thick layer of pyrogenic lime plaster. While sheer quantity of high-quality plaster signaled elite associations, technical mastery was also important in this regard. This is seen in the 8-millimeter thick, fine pyrogenic lime plaster floor found in room 1 of Building 17 at Agios Dimitrios, which was likely meant to store or process liquids. It was constructed in 3 layers with distinct compositions, including a middle one with pozzolanic inclusions, indicating significant technical expertise in its construction. Our analyses indicate that even among pyrogenic lime plaster surfaces at the site, different recipes were used in different contexts to create specialized surfaces in a scale and complexity that went far beyond structural requirements, suggesting these surfaces were constructed with the explicit intent of creating social space imbued with meaning. A similar nexus of elite status, monumentality, technical expertise, and the large-scale use of lime plaster in important contexts for social interaction has been noted elsewhere in the ancient world. Our excavations in the central court, or room 1 of Building 16 at KAD, have revealed an impressive space with a plaster floor lined with benches that converge at a large octagonal ashlar basin lined with ceramic. A narrow sondage excavated through this plaster surface along the face of the northern bench revealed a series of thin 3.6 millimeter average white plaster surfaces underlying the topmost, interspersed with thicker layers of darker sediment. Micromorphology analysis identified actually 11 such surfaces composed of lime plaster with layers of crushed calcite and sediment fill in between, indicating a regular program of renewal over Building 16's use life, a component of placemaking that contributed to the building's monumentality. The temporal interval between these new floors has not yet been determined, nor do we know yet whether their installation is prompted by degradation of the underlying floor or is related to cyclical ritual activity. The layers of meaning encoded in these diverse materials were communicated to various audiences through placemaking. The entanglement of these material assemblages with people in contexts created for social interactions, through which identities were negotiated and displayed and power dynamics were enacted. As Carl Nappett's seminal study of human material interactions makes abundantly clear, such relationships operate at various scales, from the micro-scale proximate interactions of individuals making and using things, to wider networks that link distant quarries to monumental buildings or foreign ceramic shops to Cypriot ceremonial feasts. And there's this soil column showing those layers of plaster. The creation of the so-called fortresses in the Middle Cypriot III to Late Cypriot I, and perhaps even earlier, marked an initial venture in large-scale monumental construction. It was in the Late Cypriot IIc, IIIa period, however, that ruling elites on the island embarked on an ambitious strategy of monumental placemaking that would not only materialize their control over resources in a seemingly permanent way, but more importantly, would provide context for interactions that created and reproduced social structures and collective memories that supported their power. In examining the nature of authority in early complex societies, Adam Smith argues that monumental architecture and planning are active instruments for shaping behavior, attitudes, and emotions as part of the means by which power is both legitimized and enacted. The late Cypriot monumental buildings, as the context of feasts, cultic activities, and other ritual performances, played an integral role in social interaction during this transformative period. Above all, these buildings were, and for that matter still are, places imbued with meanings through which status and power were negotiated and displayed through the gatherings and social occasions that took place within them. As urban theorist Kevin Lynch argues, occasion and place will reinforce each other to create a vivid present. But the effectiveness of a place as a context of interaction also draws on the past through the development of tradition, etching it into the collective memories of those who participated in the sensory-rich social occasions held within its walls. In this way, ashlar-lined monumental buildings situated in new urban landscapes came to replace the mortuary sphere as the primary arenas in which late Cypriot socio-political dynamics were enacted. It is difficult to overemphasize the importance of the new cities in transforming social life. Of course, any permanence attributed to these monumental buildings was ultimately fleeting. Even during the late Bronze Age, some edifices, like Ankami's ashlar building, were irrevocably changed, its grand hall raised and its monumental heart built over with a staircase, as the sanctuary of the horn god effaced the memory of the previous inhabitants. Of course, these structures, for the most part, did not simply disappear at the end of the late Bronze Age. The destroyed or abandoned cities of the late Bronze Age retained a significant presence on the early Iron Age, a significant presence in the landscape of early Iron Age Cyprus and would come to play a role in the establishment and legitimation of the new social order that appeared with the emergence of the city kingdoms during the 9th and 8th centuries BCE. Indeed, the ruling elites of the subsequent Iron Age quite deliberately appropriated the potent symbolism of late Bronze Age ashlar masonry, if not the blocks themselves, and in some cases, entire buildings. I thank Maria for this photo of these finely drafted late Bronze Age ashlar blocks recut and reused in the southern facade of the late archaic, the classical so-called palace building in the Haji Abdullah locality of Paphos. We don't know precisely when the late Cypriot monuments transitioned from being potential sources of socio-political power and legitimation to merely being quarries for building stone. The large-scale robbing of ashlar masonry at Moroni Vornes and Kalabasa Sais Demetrios during the late Roman period suggest, for example, that by then their role as places on the landscape was significantly altered. The archaeological recovery, interpretation, and display of these late Cypriot monuments in the modern era has engaged them once again in the enactment of socio-political dynamics and identity formation, reminding us that monumentality is a process rather than a state, and perhaps leading us to ponder the eventual fate of Apple's ground scraper. Thank you.
We certainly thank you, Kevin, for a truly original and in many respects pioneering analysis, and also for promoting and encouraging your students to take this analysis to new levels. It has far-reaching implications for future research, and your monograph is a first as regards monumentality in late Bronze Age Cyprus. So